Control your emotions, understand incentives, and weave dependency.
There is a specific type of person that you meet occasionally throughout your life. Someone who seems to operate at a different frequency than most. While others are swept away by emotions, that person remains cold. While others react impulsively, this person calculates methodically. While others remain stuck in mediocrity, this person accumulates wealth with almost mechanical precision. You may have attributed it to luck, connections, or some unfair advantage. But what if I told you that there is a specific structure of thought, an operational code, that separates these people from the rest of humanity, and that this code was documented more than 500 years ago by a man that history has made synonymous with cold manipulation? The word Machiavellian entered the vocabulary as an insult. But here's the disturbing truth. Those who amass extraordinary wealth and power often operate by the very principles Machiavelli documented. Not because they are morally superior or inferior, but because they understand something fundamental about human nature and power mechanics that remains invisible to most. Niccolò Machiavelli was not an ivory tower philosopher speculating on ideals. He was a political operator who spent 14 years in the royal corridors of power in Florence, observing, documenting, analyzing how princes, popes, and tyrants conquered and maintained dominance. When he was tortured and exiled in 1513, he distilled these remarks into a manuscript that would shock Europe for centuries. Not because it taught a new form of cruelty has always existed, but because it completely removed the moral veneer that had traditionally surrounded discussions of power. He did not describe how princes should act according to Christian virtues. He described how princes who win really act. And here's your problem. You live in a world ruled by these dynamics, but you've probably been brought up in a completely different narrative. They taught him that hard work guarantees reward, that honesty always wins, that the universe is fundamentally fair. These are beautiful ideas. They are also structurally false. While you play by these idealized rules, others, the cold, the calculating, the rich, play by the real code. And the asymmetry of this dynamic ensures that you'll keep losing while remaining unconscious. Throughout this video, we're going to do something that few have the courage to do. We're going to extract 5 specific tactics from the Machiavellian Code, not as historical curiosity, but as practical and immediately applicable tools for navigating brutal reality of wealth acquisition. These are not superficial success tips. These are deep operating principles that require fundamental transformation in how you see the world, interpret human behavior, and make decisions. They work. They have always worked, and they will continue to function regardless of their moral approval. But I leave you with a warning. This knowledge comes with a psychological cost. Once you see these mechanics operating around you, and you are constantly operating, you cannot unsee them. His innocence about human nature will end today. In return, you will gain clarity, and clarity, in the end, is more valuable than comfort. If you're ready for this transformation, keep going. Machiavellian tactic. 1. Suppress emotion, amplify observation. The first tactic of Machiavellian Code is to develop what I call operational detachment, the ability to completely separate what you feel from what you observe, and what you observe from what you decide. Ordinary people are slaves to immediate emotional reactions. Someone insults them, they feel angry. Someone praises them, they feel gratitude. Someone threatens them, they are afraid. Each emotion generates an automatic reaction, and these reactions make them completely predictable and therefore manipulable. The Machiavellian operator cultivates a deliberate emotional vacuum, not the absence of feeling. That's psychopathy. But conscious distance where emotion is observed, not obeyed. Where stimuli are processed through a strategic interest filter, not programmed emotional triggers. Why does this tactic work? Because emotion is fundamentally reactive and short-term, while strategy is proactive and long-term. When you operate emotionally, you are essentially allowing external circumstances and the behavior of others to dictate your responses. You have transferred control of your actions to external stimuli. This is not freedom. It is sophisticated slavery. The Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, understood this 2,000 years ago. They did not advocate the absence of emotion, but rather the recognition that there is room between stimulus and response, and in that space lies their freedom and power. Machiavelli applied this principle specifically to contexts of power and wealth. He observed that leaders who made decisions based on passion, emotional revenge, impulsive generosity, sentimental loyalty, consistently lost out to those who calculated each move based on strategic consequences. Emotional decisions optimize for immediate emotional relief. Calculated decisions optimize for long-term outcome. And in the game of wealth accumulation, a long-time horizon always wins a short-time horizon. Let me tell you a story that Machiavelli himself used as an example of cold calculation overcoming moral considerations. Ferdinand II of Aragon and the expulsion of the Spanish Jews in 1492. Ferdinand was not particularly anti-Semitic by medieval standards. It had Jewish ministers, Jewish counselors, and depended significantly on Jewish capital. But he faced a strategic problem. He needed to consolidate Spain's newly unified power, and the Catholic Church, the most politically powerful force, pushed for religious uniformity. A leader operating emotionally or morally would have two obvious options: defend his Jewish subjects on principle and alienate the Church and powerful Catholic factions, or persecute them out of genuine religious conviction. Fernando did something more calculated. He issued the Alhambra decree expelling all Jews who refused conversion. But here's the crucial thing. He structured decree to maximize strategic gain while minimizing real cost. First, he gave 4 months, enough time for wealthy Jews to negotiate private conversions while keeping their financial capacities available for the crown, or to sell property hastily, generating acquisition opportunities for Ferdinand's supporters. Second, he allowed Jews to take portable goods, but not gold or silver, effectively confiscating precious metals while appearing leniency for allowing them to leave. Third, he used crisis as an opportunity to forgive debts that the crown owed to Jewish creditors who were being expelled. The result? Ferdinand's solidified alliance with the Church, confiscated massive wealth, eliminated substantial debts, and positioned himself as a defender of the faith, all while keeping the most economically useful Jewish converts operationally functional. It was brutal, it was calculated, and it was extraordinarily effective strategically. Ferdinand died as one of the most powerful and wealthy monarchs in Europe. Machiavelli did not praise the morality of this action. He simply observed, a leader operating by cold calculation achieved multiple goals simultaneously that a leader operating by emotion or conventional morality could never have achieved. This principle operates constantly in the modern corporate world, but with a veneer of professionalism that obscures fundamental nature. Consider corporate restructurings. CEO receives analysis showing that laying off 1,000 employees would increase profitability by 15%. Emotionally, decision is agonizing. These are real people with real families. Morally, it may seem unfair, especially if the company is profitable, but CEO operating Machiavellian doesn't process decision through an emotional or moral lens. It processes through a strategic lens. What impact on stock price? How will shareholders react? What message does this send to the market about operational efficiency? How does this position the company against competitors? If strategic analysis favors layoffs, they happen. And CEOs who can execute those decisions without paralyzing themselves in emotional guilt consistently outperform CEOs who morally agonize over every difficult choice. Or observe high-level negotiators. When someone tries to intimidate them, they don't feel fear followed by capitulation. When someone tries to seduce them, they don't feel attraction followed by compromise. They observe tactics being used, mentally categorize them, and calculate optimal responses based on strategic objectives, completely decoupled from the emotional reaction that tactic was intended to produce. This creates massive asymmetric advantage. Most are being manipulated through emotional triggers that they don't even realize exist. The cold trader sees these manipulation attempts in real time and is not affected. Tactic 1. Implement what I call a 24-hour pause protocol for meaningful decisions. When you feel a strong emotional impulse, anger that demands immediate response, excitement that presses for impulsive action, fear that urges capitulation, impose a forced 24-hour break before acting. During this break, write down real strategic goals separate from emotional state. The next day, ask, if I were an unbiased consultant observing my situation, what action would I recommend? Often the response will be dramatically different from the initial emotional impulse. Tactic 2. Develop clinical observation of your own emotions. When you feel strong emotion, instead of identifying with it, I'm furious, watch it from a distance. I'm experiencing a feeling of anger. This subtle linguistic shift creates crucial psychological distance. Then ask, what specific trigger produced this response? Is this person, situation manipulating me through this trigger? What answer serves my long-term interests versus satisfies short-term emotional drive? With practice, you develop the ability to feel emotion without being commanded by it, exactly the ability Machiavelli observed in more effective leaders. Machiavellian Tactic 2. Study interests, ignore words. The second tactic of the Machiavellian Code is to develop structural skepticism about verbal communication while cultivating keen observation of material incentives. People say what they believe they should say, what benefits to say, or what they unconsciously feel compelled to say. They rarely tell the full truth about their real motivations. But their actions, especially patterns of actions over time, reveal true interests with near-perfect accuracy. The Machiavellian operator never asks, what is this person saying, as a primary question. He always asks, what are the structural incentives of this person? What do they gain or lose based on different outcomes? How do their actions over time reveal real versus stated priorities? Why does this tactic work? Because there is fundamental dissonance between what humans profess to value, social narrative, and what they actually pursue, material interest. This dissonance is not necessarily conscious hypocrisy. It is often sophisticated self-deception where people genuinely believe their stated narratives while unconsciously pursuing completely different interests. Behavioral economists have documented this extensively. Robin Hanson and Kevin Simler wrote an entire book called The Elephant in the Brain about this phenomenon. Humans constantly engage in signaling, behavior designed to communicate certain qualities, while vehemently denying that they are doing so. Machiavelli observed this at the level of states and leaders. Princes declared that wars were about honor, faith, or justice. Machiavelli observed that wars were always about territory, resources, or neutralizing threats. The rhetoric was performance for public consumption. Material interest was the real engine. And here's crucial insight. If you make decisions based on what people say versus what they're structurally incentivized to do, you'll be consistently misled and exploited. Let's return to the story of Cesare Borgia and Ramiro di Orco, but this time through the lens of incentive versus word analysis. When Cesare appointed Ramiro as governor of Romagna, Ramiro publicly swore undying loyalty, promised to serve Cesare's interests faithfully, and expressed deep gratitude for the trust placed in him. His words were those of a dedicated subordinate. But Cesare, operating Machiavellian, did not focus on Ramiro's words. He analyzed structural incentives. Ramiro now commanded the army. Ramiro controlled the tax system. Ramiro was building direct relationships with local powerful families. Ramiro was accumulating significant personal wealth through position. Structurally, Ramiro was becoming less dependent on Cesare and more able to operate independently. And an individual with military power, wealth, and local connections who technically serves distant lord has every incentive to eventually pursue independence. Cesare did not wait for manifest treason. He needed no confession or evidence of conspiracy. He simply acknowledged that Ramiro's structural incentives were diverging from his own, and that not declarations of loyalty would determine future behavior. So Cesare acted preemptively, eliminating Ramiro precisely at the moment when he had completed utility, pacifying the region, but before divergent incentives produced inevitable betrayal. Another governor might have been deceived by Ramiro's protestations of loyalty until it was too late. Cesare, analyzing incentives versus words, kept complete control. This principle is perhaps the most immediately useful in modern context. Consider business negotiations. Counterpart says, "We are pursuing mutually beneficial long-term partnership." Sounds wonderful. But a Machiavellian trader asks, what incentives does this person company have? If they can extract short-term value and exit, do they win? Does their compensation structure reward long-term results or short-term metrics? Does their track record show genuine loyalty to partners or opportunistic changes? If structural incentives don't align with long-term partnership rhetoric, all the legal documentation in the world won't prevent eventual opportunistic behavior. Or consider employment dynamics. Employer says, "You're part of the family. We value loyalty." But structurally, the company responds to shareholders who demand quarterly profitability. Economically, the company is encouraged to minimize labor costs. Legally, the company can fire you with minimal notice. Emotionally operating employee believes in the family narrative and remains loyal, sacrificing external opportunities. Then he is fired during the next restructuring. An employee operating Machiavellian ignores rhetoric, observes structural incentives, and maintains constant preparation for change because he understands that corporate loyalty is performance, not reality. Even in personal relationships, though here the application requires more nuance, observing patterns of behavior versus words is revealing. A person who constantly professes love but consistently prioritizes other interests over relationship is revealing truth through actions, not words. Tactic 1. For any negotiation, partnership, or meaningful professional relationship, conduct what I call an incentive audit. Before relying on any verbal statement, map out how is this person, entity compensated? What metrics determine their success? What results maximize their gain versus their gain? If interests diverge, when and how will divergence manifest itself? So structure agreements assuming that their interests, not their words, will guide behavior. Build protections against inevitable divergence instead of relying on promises of alignment. Tactic 2. Develop what I call historical pattern analysis. Don't judge a person, organization, based on what they say they will do. Judge them based on verifiable patterns of what they have done in similar situations before. The company that laid off massively during the last recession will probably do it again, regardless of current rhetoric about commitment to the team. Individual who has cheated on previous partners when convenient is likely to cheat on you under similar pressure. The past is not perfectly predictive, but it is infinitely more reliable than promises about the future. Machiavellian Tactic 3. Cultivate a symmetric dependency in every transaction. The third tactic of the Machiavellian Code is to systematically structure every relationship, transaction, and agreement so that another party depends on you more than you depend on them. This does not mean eliminating interdependence. This is impossible in a complex society. It means carefully calibrating the dependency balance so that you always retain more leverage. Because in the end, power doesn't come from who you are or what you know. It comes from who needs you and how much they would lose if you left. The Machiavellian operator constantly asks in every interaction, who has the most to lose if this relationship ends? Who has better alternatives? Who is more easily replaceable? And then he works methodically to ensure that answers always favor his position. Why does this tactic work? Because dependence is the structural basis of all power. Medieval kings did not rule through charisma or virtue. They ruled because they controlled land. Others depended on permission to farm. Military force. Others depended on protection. And legal systems. Others depended on access to justice. Remove those dependencies, and royalty disappears. Exactly what happened in revolutions when populations developed alternative ways of securing basic necessities. In modern capitalism, the principle is identical, but mechanisms are different. You have power over your employer to the extent that you have skills that are difficult to replace. Your employer has power over you to the extent that you have no equivalent employment alternatives. Warren Buffett famously said, "Price is what you pay. Value is what you get. But there is an extension of this wisdom that is rarely cited. In any transaction, those who are more willing to walk away capture more value, and willingness to move away is a direct function of asymmetrical dependence. If you have 10 viable alternatives and another part has one, you can easily walk away. They can't. You will extract favorable terms. The rise of the Medici family perfectly illustrates deliberate engineering of asymmetrical dependence. In the 15th century, the papacy in Rome was the richest and most powerful institution in Christian Europe. It received tithes from all over Europe, controlled vast territories, and spent enormously on construction, wars, and patronage. Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici was not particularly wealthy by Florentine standards when he started, but he recognized opportunity. The papacy needed sophisticated banking services, money transfers across Europe, loans to finance operations, multi-currency management. Giovanni began offering these services, initially on a small scale. But he did something brilliant. Instead of just providing generic banking services, he integrated deeply into papal financial operations. He created proprietary systems to track papal recipes. He established a network of agents in key cities who knew intricacies of papal cash flows. He structured loans in ways that required regular renewal. After a decade, the relationship had fundamentally transformed. Medici were not just a bench that Papa used. They were the infrastructure through which entire papal finances operated. Changing bankers would not merely be inconvenient. It would be operationally catastrophic, requiring complete reconstruction of financial systems during transition, exposing vulnerabilities, and risking disruption of critical revenues. Meanwhile, Medici carefully diversified. Papa was an important customer, but not the only significant customer. Losing papal business would be detrimental but not fatal to Medici. The asymmetry was complete. Medici were moderately dependent on the Pope. Papa was critically dependent on the Medici. And this asymmetry has translated into extraordinarily favorable terms, unprecedented political access, and massive enrichment. When Cosimo de' Medici, Giovanni's grandson, was briefly exiled from Florence in 1433, the Pope pushed for his return because papal financial operations were suffering. Cosimo returned triumphant a year later. Asymmetric dependence had been transformed into real political power. This principle operates massively in modern economics, especially in technology. Consider Apple's strategy. Initially, Apple relied on multiple suppliers for components. This dependence gave leverage to suppliers. So, Apple systematically redesigned relationships, developed proprietary chips, reducing dependence on Intel and Qualcomm, entered into exclusive long-term contracts with key manufacturers, and in critical cases, bought suppliers altogether. Simultaneously, Apple has created an ecosystem where consumers become progressively more dependent. Buy iPhone, then iPad syncs perfectly. Add Apple Watch, use iCloud for photos, buy apps that only work on iOS. Each purchase increases the cost of output. Result? Apple has hundreds of millions of highly dependent customers, but it is minimally dependent on any individual customer. It has suppliers that rely critically on Apple contracts but maintains alternatives for most components. Asymmetric dependence on an industrial scale. Or look at individual pros who have mastered this tactic. They don't just do work that the employer wants. They become repositories of critical institutional knowledge. They build unique relationships with key customers. They document systems in ways that only they fully understand. At the same time, they maintain transferable skills, an active professional network, and a constant awareness of alternative opportunities. If they are fired, they find new employment quickly. If they leave, the company suffers significant disruption. Tactic 1. Conduct quarterly dependency audit. List all significant economic relationships, employers, customers, suppliers, partners. To each one, answer honestly. On a scale of 1-10, how much do they depend on me? How much do I depend on them? If their score is lower than your score, you're vulnerable. So develop a plan. How do I reduce my dependence? By creating alternatives. How do I increase dependence on them? By becoming more indispensable or increasing output costs. Execute systematically over time. Tactic 2. In every new relationship or significant transaction, consciously build in switching costs for another party. If you are a service provider, don't just deliver results. Integrate into their processes, create proprietary systems, develop institutional knowledge. If you're employed, don't just perform tasks. Become an expert in critical systems, build unique relationships, document, but not completely, complex processes. The goal isn't sabotage or hostages, it's to make your replacement more expensive and risky than to keep you on favorable terms. This is the essence of deliberately constructed asymmetric dependence. Pause and absorb what we have established. These first 3 tactics are not productivity hacks or networking tips. They are fundamental reconfiguration of how you process reality. You have learned to separate emotion from decision, creating distance between stimulus and response where power resides. You've learned to ignore words and focus on structural incentives, seeing through performances for real motivations. And you learn to systematically build asymmetric dependence, turning each relationship into a source of leverage. These are foundations. These are defenses. With these 3 tactics, you stop being manipulated so easily. You see the game being played all around you. You build positions of strength. But defensive knowledge only prevents loss. It does not create gain. The next 2 tactics are different. They are not about protection. They are about strategic predation. They are about actively shaping the environment around you, manipulating perceptions, and creating realities that serve your interests. And these tactics cross a line that many consider morally unacceptable. They require a willingness to deceive when necessary, willingness to instrumentalize relationships, willingness to operate in ethical gray areas that make people uncomfortable. Machiavelli was demonized not for teaching cruelty. There were princes far more cruel than him. It has been demonized for making explicit that strategic ruthlessness, deliberate deception, and calculated manipulation are tools that effective leaders use when circumstances require it. If you prefer to maintain the illusion that extraordinary wealth can be achieved with complete moral purity, this is the time to stop. But if you want to see the full game, not as it should be played according to ethics professors, but as it is played by those who actually win, the next 2 tactics will reveal that without filter. Machiavellian Tactic 4. Narrative control, not just actions. The 4th tactic of the Machiavellian Code is to recognize that in the human realm, perception often matters more than objective reality. Therefore, controlling how your actions are interpreted is just as important as the actions themselves. Ordinary people focus on doing the right things and assume that results will speak for themselves. Machiavellian operator understands that results are ambiguous and require interpretation. And whoever controls interpretation captures value regardless of who generated the result. This isn't about superficial personal marketing. It's about strategic narrative engineering where you deliberately shape how your actions, motivations, and character are perceived by different audiences, often telling different stories to different groups. Why does this tactic work? Because humans do not experience objective reality. They experiment with narratives about reality. Historian Yuval Noah Harari argues in *Sapiens* that human distinctive capacity is not reason or use of tools, but ability to create and believe in collective fictions, religions, nations, corporations, money. These are shared narratives, not physical objects, but they govern behavior as powerfully as laws of physics. Machiavelli applied this on an individual level. Your reputation is not an objective reflection of who you are. It is a collective narrative that others have built about you, based on selective fragments of information, interpreted through your prejudices. And here's crucial insight. If you don't actively control that narrative, others will control it for you, often in ways that serve their interests, not yours. Consider 2 leaders with the same objective results. One allows others to interpret actions freely. Another actively shapes narrative through strategic communication, ad timing, association with powerful symbols, and control of what information is revealed versus concealed. The second captures disproportionate credit, builds reputation that multiplies opportunities, and can even turn failures into narratives of learning and resilience. The former may do excellent work but remains invisible or misunderstood. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58-50 BC is a masterful case of narrative control, transforming military success into absolute political power. Objectively, Caesar's campaign was a series of brutal wars against tribes that often posed no real threat to Rome. He invaded territories not authorized by the Senate, massacred civilian populations, and sought personal glory as much as Roman security. But Caesar understood something that other generals did not. Military conquest without narrative control is only temporary. Then he did something unprecedented. He wrote his own commentaries on the Gallic War, distributed in Rome while campaigns were still going on. These commentaries were not objective records. They were masterful propaganda disguised as factual reports. Caesar wrote in the third person, "Caesar did this, Caesar decided that," creating the illusion of objectivity while completely controlling narrative. He portrayed every war as defensive. Gauls were menacing barbarians. Their actions were protection from Roman allies. He omitted his own provocations. He exaggerated enemy numbers to magnify victories. He described questionable decisions as brilliant strategic necessities. He included fascinating ethnographic details about Gallic customs, making accounts not just propaganda but educational entertainment. Crucially, he wrote in simple and clear Latin, accessible to all literate Romans, not just the aristocratic elite. He democratized his propaganda. The result? While Caesar conquered Gaul, he simultaneously conquered Roman public opinion. Ordinary citizens saw him as a protective hero. When the Senate eventually tried to recall him and impeach him, the populace supported Caesar, not the Senate. Compare with Pompey, Caesar's rival. Pompey had equally impressive military achievements, but he depended on others to report his deeds. Narrative about Pompey was fragmented, controlled by various historians with different agendas, often focusing on aspects that did not serve their interests. When civil war between Caesar and Pompey began, both had similar military power. But Caesar had won narrative war years earlier, and narrative, in the end, determined which side citizens and soldiers supported. Caesar crossed the Rubicon and became dictator of Rome not only because he had loyal legions, but because he had constructed narrative where he was Rome's protector, not a threat to it. Narrative control turned betrayal into salvation in the minds of the public. This principle is perhaps the most visible in the modern age of social media and instant communication. Consider Elon Musk. Objectively, he has successes and failures like any entrepreneur. Tesla almost went bankrupt multiple times. SpaceX had expensive explosions. Their timeline predictions are notoriously overly optimistic. But Musk is a master of narrative control. He uses Twitter to communicate directly with millions, bypassing traditional media. It reveals selectively, sharing successes widely, burying flaws in technical reports that few read. He associates his products with grandiose narratives: save humanity, make life multiplanetary, accelerate sustainable transition. These narratives turn expensive electric cars into symbols of futuristic vision. When it makes mistakes, it controls narrative by framing it as rapid iteration and learning, terms valued in startup culture. What would be seen as incompetence in traditional CEOs is reinterpreted as audacious innovation. Compare with executives who are equally competent but don't control narrative. They can generate better results but receive fraction of the recognition, market valuation, and influence. Or observe CEOs during crises. Some allow the media and critics to define narrative. Result: even successes are interpreted cynically or negatively. Others take control immediately, communicate proactively, frame the situation on their terms, provide alternative narrative before critics solidify theirs. Mark Zuckerberg learned this painfully. After the Cambridge Analytica scandal, he initially went silent, allowing the narrative of Facebook maliciously violates privacy to solidify. It cost billions in market value. In subsequent crises, he responded more quickly and strategically, framing problems as systemic industrial challenges, not Facebook-specific failures. Tactic 1. For each significant project or achievement, develop narrative strategy before execution. Don't wait until you have results to think about how to communicate them. Ask in advance. What story do I want people to tell about this? What symbols or associations reinforce this story? What details to include versus omit? Who are key audiences and what narrative resonates with each? Then, during execution, strategically document photos, metrics, testimonies, elements that support the desired narrative. When you share results, you're not improvising. You're executing a prepared narrative plan. Tactic 2. Cultivate what I call strategic selective transparency. Paradoxically, sharing certain vulnerabilities or flaws increases credibility and narrative control. But the key is selectivity. You reveal weaknesses that are relatable but not fatal. Mistakes that have been corrected by showing growth, or challenges that you have overcome by demonstrating resilience. Meanwhile, truly damaging flaws or aspects that contradict the desired narrative remain private. This creates an appearance of radical honesty, because you admit some negative things, while maintaining control over general perception. Machiavelli would thoroughly approve, using selective truth to build trust that obscures more important deceptions. Machiavellian Tactic 5. Operate through proxies. Never expose yourself completely. The fifth and final tactic of Machiavellian code is to structure your operations so that other people perform controversial or risky actions while you maintain deniability, preserve reputation, and capture benefits. The advanced Machiavellian operator rarely directly does what he can have an intermediary do for him. Not out of cowardice, but out of strategic calculation. Direct actions create direct responsibility, legal vulnerability, and reputational association. Actions through proxies create layers of insulation. This manifests itself on multiple levels, using subsidiary companies for risky trades, using intermediaries for delicate dealings, using outside consultants for unpopular decisions, and using organizational structures that compartmentalize responsibility. Why does this tactic work? Because in complex systems, attribution of responsibility is malleable and can be architected. In simple structures, a person performs action, experiences consequence, responsibility is clear. But in complex structures with multiple organizational layers, collective decisions, and distributed execution, accountability becomes diffuse. Machiavelli observed that effective princes deliberately created this diffusion. When something cruel but necessary needed to be done, the wise prince did not personally execute it. He appointed lieutenants, gave authority, allowed action, and then, if political backlash occurred, sacrificed the lieutenant, preserving his own position. This is not merely about avoiding blame. It's about preserving political and reputational capital, which are finite resources. Every controversial action you take directly eats up that capital. Executed through proxy, the proxy absorbs the cost. Sociologist Irving Goffman described this as impression management. Humans constantly manage how they are perceived through information control and associations. Operation through proxies is a sophisticated form of print management where you dissociate yourself from potentially reputationally damaging actions. One of the clearest historical examples of this tactic is the assassination of Thomas Becket in 1170 and subsequent response by King Henry II of England. Becket had been Henry's Lord Chancellor, his closest ally and policy enforcer. When Henry appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury, he hoped that Becket would continue to serve royal interests. Instead, Becket took ecclesiastical roles seriously and began opposing Henry's policies that infringed on church authority. This created fundamental conflict. Henry needed Becket removed to consolidate real power over the church in England, but assassinating an archbishop directly would be scandalous, potentially catastrophic politically. According to historical records, in a moment of frustration, Henry allegedly exclaimed, "Is no one going to get rid of this troublesome priest?" 4 knights who heard it interpreted this as an implied order and traveled to Canterbury, where they murdered Becket in the cathedral. Now comes the Machiavellian part. Henry immediately denied ordering murder. He expressed horror. He performed dramatic public penance. He walked barefoot to Becket's tomb, allowed monks to flog him. He punished the knights lightly. But the net result? Becket was dead. Ecclesiastical opposition to Henry's policies collapsed, and Henry, through penitence theater, turned potential disaster into a demonstration of piety and humility. He obtained benefit, removal of obstacle, while avoiding cost, responsibility for the murder. The writers absorbed guilt. Henry preserved reputation and even increased it through strategic penance. This is proxy operation in its most brutal form, creating conditions where others carry out their will without explicit order, then dissociates from actions while capturing benefits. This tactic is constantly operating at modern corporate and financial levels, but in more legally sophisticated ways. Consider corporate structures. Wealthy companies create complex hierarchies of subsidiaries, LLCs, offshore holding companies. When risky operation is required, developing potentially dangerous product, entering ethically questionable market, cutting costs drastically, operation is executed through subsidiary. If it works, benefits flow to the parent company. Whether it creates legal liability or relational disaster, subsidiary may be sacrificed through bankruptcy while parent company remains isolated. This is not accidental. It is deliberate architecture of compartmentalized responsibility. Or consider how tech companies handle content moderation. They don't want to be seen to be directly censoring. It would damage the reputation of free speech supporters. Then they create independent supervisory boards, or hire third-party moderation firms. When controversial censorship decisions occur, the company may say, "It wasn't our decision. It was the independent boards," or third-party contractors applied policies. Proxy absorbs criticism. Company maintains deniability. Even on an individual level, sophisticated professionals use this tactic. When CEOs need to communicate bad news, layoffs, benefit cuts, unpopular changes, they often don't do it directly. The announcement comes from VP of HR or leadership team. CEO remains available to listen to feedback and work through transition, positioned as an empathetic mediator, not decision maker. In negotiations, experienced negotiators often create principles that need approval from others: CEO, board, investors. This allows them to make tough demands. "I personally think your offer is fair, but my board would never approve less than X," while maintaining positive personal relationships. The invisible proxy, advice, is the villain. Negotiator is an ally trying to help. Tactic. 1. Develop what I call an operational isolation framework. For any project, decision, or operation that has the potential for public failure or controversy, create a structural layer between you and execution. This can be forming a separate LLC for risky venture, legal protection, hiring a consultant to analyze and recommend cuts, reputational protection, having subordinate announce unpopular changes, relationship preservation, or using a committee for controversial decisions, dilution of liability. Not to avoid ultimate responsibility, you still retain control, but to create narrative options if the outcome is negative. Tactic 2. Cultivate a network of authorized but deniable agents. These are people who understand their goals and interests deeply enough to act in alignment, but technically operate autonomously. It could be a senior executive you've mentored, a long-term consultant who knows your preferences, or even a business partner with aligned interests. When delicate situations arise, you can ask for advice or explore options with them, creating the possibility that they act in ways that you want, but without explicit order. If action generates backlash, you have technical deniability. If it succeeds, you capture benefit. This requires sophisticated relationships based on deep mutual understanding, not explicit direction. Exactly what Henry II had created with his knights. The synthesis of the 5 tactics. So we come to the end of this journey through the Machiavellian Code. 5 tactics that, practiced consistently, fundamentally transform how you operate in a world of competition for resources and power. Let's summarize. Tactic 1. Suppress emotion, amplify observation. Create deliberate distance between stimulus and response. Observe your emotions without obeying. Process decisions through the lens of long-term strategic interest, not short-term emotional gratification. This makes you unpredictable to others, while everyone else remains predictable to you. Tactic 2. Study interests, ignore words, develop structural skepticism about verbal communication. Always ask, what are this person's structural incentives? Analyze historical patterns of behavior. Assume that actions, not statements, reveal truth. This prevents you from being manipulated by rhetoric while allowing you to manipulate through accurate reading of real motivations. Tactic 3. Cultivate asymmetric dependency. Systematically structure each relationship so that others depend on you more than you depend on them. Reduce your own dependencies through diversification and alternatives. Increase dependence on others through deep integration, switching costs, and indispensability. This turns every interaction into a source of leverage. Tactic 4. Control narrative, not just actions. Recognize that perception often trumps reality. Develop narrative strategy for each significant venture. Document strategically. Communicate proactively. Frame your actions in terms that serve your interests. Practice selective transparency to build credibility while hiding real weaknesses. This multiplies captured value from each success. Tactic 5. Operate through proxies. Never directly do what you can have an intermediary do. Create layers of isolation between you and controversial actions. Use corporate structures, human intermediaries, and committee decisions to compartmentalize accountability. Preserve reputational and political capital by maintaining deniability while capturing benefits. This protects you from downside while exposing the upside. The uncomfortable truth. These 5 tactics work, not occasionally, consistently. They have been functioning for 500 years since Machiavelli documented them, and for millennia before that in the undocumented practices of conquerors and accumulators of wealth. But let me be absolutely clear about something that most avoid discussing. These tactics have real psychological and moral cost. Cool, calculated operation is effective, but it can stunt the capacity for genuine human connection. Skepticism about words protects against manipulation, but it can evolve into paralyzing cynicism. Asymmetrical dependence creates power, but also structural loneliness. Narrative control multiplies impact, but can create dissonance between public persona and private self. Operation through proxies protects you, but compartmentalizes morality in uncomfortable ways. People who have completely mastered the Machiavellian code often accumulate extraordinary wealth. They also often suffer deep isolation, paranoia about the motivations of others, and questioning whether empire built justified personal cost. What will you do with this information? The vast majority who have watched this video will feel momentary discomfort. They will label this knowledge as immoral, cynical, or negative. It is a psychological defense mechanism, a convenient justification for returning to comfortable mediocrity and the comforting illusion that the world is fundamentally fair. They will choose comfort over truth. But you stayed until the end. The fact that you've made it this far suggests that the seed of dissatisfaction with the status quo is already planted. You suspected that the game was rigged, and now you see the structure of that rigging. The code is revealed. The 5 tactics are before you. They are not inherently good or bad. They are like fire, a tool that can heat a house or set it on fire. Power does not judge its bearer. It only obeys those who understand its laws. The question now is not whether this code works. History proves conclusively that it is. The question is whether you possess the stomach fortitude and clarity of purpose to execute it. The path to being cold, calculating, and rich is mapped out, but it is a lonely path, and it's dark. Most will retreat. Most are expected to back down. The only question left is, will you?